So I am Brian Jeffries, Executive Director of the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. And you heard about the governor's energy strategy and the initiatives therein. One of those is the corridors that we're trying to establish. So I'm going to just take us quickly through what is it, how did it come to be, where are we in the process, and what is it we hope to accomplish. The start for all this is appreciation for revenues to the state government, where they come from in Wyoming. This is actually why the Wyoming Pipeline Authority and the Infrastructure Authority have come to be in the first place. Probably outside of Alaska, there is no state that is more heavily dependent upon mineral-related taxes than Wyoming. And this is a slide from fiscal 2010. This pie chart doesn't change a whole lot. And roughly 2/3 of revenues available to the state come from oil, gas, and coal. There's some others, gravel, trona, that are in there. But oil, gas, and coal make up 2/3 of the tax and royalty revenues to the state. And that's why the Pipeline Authority was created a number of years ago, because as to natural gas, owing to a lack of pipeline capacity, natural gas in Wyoming often sold for as little as 50% of natural gas produced in other traditional producing states like Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana. And because tax revenues to the state is a simple equation of volume times price times tax rate, leaving half the dollar value of the product on the table owing to a lack of capacity, just directly goes through the state revenues. The same appreciation for the need to get your product to the market is why the Infrastructure Authority exists as well. And we've largely, corrected the natural gas pipeline issue. Prices for natural gas in Wyoming are essentially at parity with other producing states. The Pipeline Authority actually used to be called the Natural Gas Pipeline Authority. The name was changed a few years back to recognize that there are other activities involving pipelines that are related to the production of oil and gas. And that takes us into the business of carbon dioxide pipelines and wanting to foster the development of those. Okay. Little production history. I set this as a ratio going back to the year 2002 to show you how natural gas volumes and oil volumes in the state have changed over time. A lot of the gas production in Wyoming is relatively dry natural gas, which means it's not produced with other components such as ethane, propane, and butane that carry a higher value tied to oil prices. And that's led to a reduction in the amount of drilling activity in Wyoming for natural gas, but conversely supports additional drilling for oil or other means of producing additional oil, including enhanced oil recovery involving carbon dioxide. And that uptick you see there towards the right of the chart for oil is driven by growth and enhanced, in part driven by growth and enhanced oil recovery taking place in the state. So that's a volume chart, and a value chart sometimes helpful as well. This is historically over the same period. I just took the total dollars available to the state from taxes and royalties on natural gas and on oil in a given year. So for a given year, I took 100% of the revenues that year and apportioned them back out based upon volume and price to oil or gas. It's another way of showing that the production of oil has become relatively more important in Wyoming than it has been for quite a while, and conversely, the proportion coming from gas is dropping. That white line across the middle is the 50-50 line. So both from a volume-driven standpoint and a price-driven standpoint, oil is growing in importance. And these numbers are rolling 12s. It just took some of the spikiness out of it to do that. We started several years ago looking at a carbon dioxide pipeline system to support enhanced oil recovery in the state. That started with looking at sources and destinations. There had been a study done by the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute where they looked at every single field in Wyoming and basically scored it as to its technical, engineering, and economic viability for enhanced oil recovery. Went through each field. They analyzed several different price decks for price of carbon dioxide, price of oil, and came up with a model to indicate if you had the carbon dioxide and you had the pipeline system in place, what sort of incremental volume of oil and incremental dollars could you create? And I forget the volume number, but the number that really stuck in my head was the tax revenue and royalty revenue to the state from the oil they identified was $5 billion worth of revenues. Those opportunities for enhanced oil recovery resided in several different parts of the state. We talked about sources and destinations, so the Bighorn Basin identified a variety of areas in the basin. Greater Green River Basin, similar, and you can see some of the existing pipeline system for carbon dioxide displayed on this map. So, right, sorry I can't reach that one over there. Existing pipeline systems moving carbon dioxide in the state, because we've been doing this in the state for a very long time. It's not a new concept. In the Powder River Basin, likewise, opportunities to revitalize old fields, go into a brownfield development and extract additional oil out of them. So that gives us destinations. We had an idea of sources of CO2, because you have to balance the market. You have to have someplace to get it from in order to have someplace to take it to. This was their assessment of locations where naturally occurring carbon dioxide could be expected to be found and produced in commercial quantities at a reasonable price, so distributed throughout the state. This particular map didn't include sources, man-made sources such as power plants, but as we go through this discussion, I'll mention those as well. So some years back, we had this identification of sources and destinations. The next thing we did, and this was essentially a tabletop exercise, we wanted to ask ourselves, okay, with this supply of carbon dioxide and this opportunity to produce incremental oil, what sort of pipeline system would you need to accomplish that? So we anointed ourselves Parliament for the day with an unlimited checkbook to go out and postulate, knowing where we would ultimately want to go and where we would ultimately want to come from. What sort of pipeline system might work to do that? And of course, there's a million permutations. You could lay lines all over the place and you could postulate order of development. But in this particular version, we took advantage of where we thought CO2 would come from. We took advantage of where we might get sources from power plants or coal to liquids plants. We also took into account that we might be taking some of the CO2 to sequestration sites not associated with enhanced oil recovery, and sort of built this up over time and tried to determine, based upon nodes and links, what sort of volumes might move, and then therefore, what size pipelines would we need to build, and what would they cost? And going back to our being Parliament for the day with no restriction on funding, for, I think the number came out to be about $2 billion, we could build this pipeline system, if we could just go off and do it. The real reason for doing the study, though, wasn't to come up with the total capital cost, it was to come up with an analysis of the rate. To tell ourselves, if somebody goes out and builds this pipeline, are they going to be able to charge a rate for transportation that will recover their capital costs and not yet cripple the whole idea in the first place? And the punchline, which I considered more important than the capital cost, the rate, if you used the fields that we've identified and only the volumes of CO2 that they would actually need over time, and plugged it into the capital cost just to move from natural sources to enhanced oil recovery, we got a rate of about 90 cents an MCF for long run transportation rate. And when we plugged in power plant volumes, which added substantially to the volumes on this hypothetical system, and going to sequestration, obviously it increased the capital cost, but not as quickly as it increased the volumes. We got a rate of about 55 cents. Those struck us as not fatally flawed rates. So the idea that all of this could someday take place, to the extent there's a constraint on when and what degree that happens, it's not really going to be the cost of the pipelines to get it there. So that's where we stopped. We searched for an answer of knowing whether this was a pipe dream, no pun intended, or not. That sort of sat around in the back of our heads until the Bighorn Basin Resource Management Plan came up for renewal. For those of you not familiar with them, those are 10 to 20 year management planning documents applicable to each field office in the BLM. And if you recall an earlier slide, we identified the Bighorn Basin as being an area attractive for potential enhanced oil recovery, a lot of oil up there to be had that we would not require otherwise. The plan, the existing resource management plan, had a number of corridors in it for potential pipeline development. Well, as those of you familiar with resource management plans, they tend to get more restrictive over time. So the draft resource management plan for the Bighorn Basin came out, and the number of corridors and where those corridors were located changed. Got fewer of them and more constrained to where they went. In the draft plan, there was no anticipation for enhanced oil recovery in the basin at all, no foreseeable development of carbon dioxide pipelines in the basin at all. So that caused us first to, in conjunction with others, make remarks in the draft resource management plan to try and address that. And hopefully when the final comes out, the types of corridors that we've identified and the associated resources will be accounted for and therefore accounted in the plan. Shortly thereafter, the Lander Area Resource Management Plan came up for review and revision. And again, here was status quo. This is what the plan was when it came out. And notable in this, purple and red and the darker brown are places where the BLM in the plan anticipates that they would rather you didn't go, or in the extreme, don't plan on going there at all, you're never going to get there. So this was status quo in the Lander Resource Management Plan. The draft preferred alternative obviously made it a little more problematic to build pipelines through there. And between the Bighorn Basin revision and the Lander revision, we came to realize that perhaps the individual plans hadn't recognized that a system of pipelines for CO2, for example, that spanned multiple field offices might not have been something previously considered and considered individually in the plans. So we made comments in this plan and identified places where we thought corridors needed to be and why, and the CO2 aspect and enhanced oil recovery. And again, hopefully those will be adopted when the final comes out. That caused us to go on a little hunting mission. And I apologize for the sort of pastel nature of the background here, but we can work through it. What we discovered is that as we go across the individual resource management plans and field offices, we just sort of wondered if they actually, even in their existing state, made sense with respect to each other. And did they make sense with respect to where pipelines even were already? So here's a map showing from the Pipeline Authority's database, existing pipelines. This is all southwest Wyoming. So this is down around Opal. This is, I guess, Kemmerer, and this might be Rock Springs. So here we have the pipeline networks in place, and you can see a couple things out of it. The corridors in perhaps more newly minted revisions are more robust and better defined. Other places less so. So the boundaries that are sort of pastel and different pastel colors reflect different field offices. Well, let me make it a little easier. Let me take the pipelines away. So here we are back to individual field offices with different colors, and boy, we got a problem. We got corridors that end in space. We got robust corridors over here that end in space and not connected. Obviously, there's something going on between these different regions besides perfect communication. In the corridors are described differently as to width and size and location and just not matching up. A bit like the Tinker toys had been tossed on the ground, and one would not expect that they would line up into a coherent structure. So the corridor initiative is all about trying to rectify that issue, and by means of a right-of-way application, using it as the vehicle, go through and clean this up. And what we will do, we will file a right-of-way application on behalf of the Pipeline Authority with the BLM as the vehicle to deal with this. What our goal is to go through and make these corridors fit against what we think is a reasonable pipeline network to serve the state, and to sort of fight this battle out in front of the next individual commercial project that might consider Wyoming and otherwise might run into the reality that some of these things don't match, and just might decide that sticking their head in the fan to fight that battle is not a better alternative than investing in Arkansas. So this is all about, again, restoring volume, so that pie chart that is price times volume times tax rate, that we can make that total number bigger. So fixing this won't be easy. There's a lot of things that have to be considered because we're effectively going after each of these resource management plans. And we will continue, along with others, to remark in individual resource management plan updates specifically. And what the remarks we make in those individual revisions will match what we're going to ask for here. So we'll deal with the problem in the aggregate, and we will also deal with it in the specific, and those will be coordinated. So on this chart, just some of the sage grouse area and historical trail laid over, just indicate the competing uses and concerns of public lands have to be addressed in this process. I wanted to offer an example of why some assumptions about where you can build pipelines can be flawed. Because one of the assumptions that you might make would be, well, wherever pipelines are already is a likely place where they'll go in the future. And that's generally true. It is not always true. And these are the sorts of detail that we have to go through as we develop this plan of development and this planned pipeline network for the state. This is a place called Beef Gap. If you go to Google Maps and actually type in Beef Gap, Wyoming, it will take you right here. This is an area in the Lander resource, or in the Lander field office. And what we have, there is a Anadarko CO2 pipeline that comes off of Exxon's, and it generally runs from southwest Wyoming up to the Powder River Basin. And it runs along this corridor, this one right here. There is also a petroleum pipeline that runs through the same area. So they're running through here. This pipeline coming down from here actually sort of bends and comes through here. This is a natural gas pipeline coming down from the Bighorn Basin and going down to the network of pipelines that run parallel to I-80. So they intersect right in this little spot right here. And I couldn't tell you whether that's Beef Gap or that's Beef Gap. That's the neighborhood. So given that we have pipelines, and clearly there's a road or two in the area that we might think this was, let's just plan on going there again. Not so easy. These are two wilderness study areas overlaid over the map, and that spot where the pipelines intersected is right there. And so these wilderness study areas are pretty much no-go zones. And that gap, I think, is about 75 feet. And given the extent of these wilderness study areas, it's not a case of, well, can't go in that 75 feet, we'll just sneak around over here. This is a case where we had to come up with a whole corridor to take the place of this path you need to make from southwest Wyoming to the Powder and beyond. You can't get through there because there's just no more room. And so this is the sort of detail we go through as we're developing these maps and coming up with alternatives so that we don't effectively foreclose pipeline development, moving across the state with carbon dioxide, and inadvertently foreclose enhanced oil recovery because we didn't think this through and didn't respond in a timely fashion. It takes money. The legislature gave $2 million. They reassigned $2 million out of AML, abandoned mines funds, that had already been delivered to the state that had not been spent on their original targeted purpose. So in a footnote to the budget bill, $2 million of that was assigned to the Pipeline Authority to work in conjunction with UW in the enhanced oil recovery to move through this process. I realized the other day when I was looking at this slide that it's amazing how you can take such a complex process, distill it down to 7 bullet points, and it looks really simple, particularly to somebody who's never had any exposure to it whatsoever. Taking a 3 to 5 year process and laying it out like that does seem, we'll just march right through. I think most of the people in this room are familiar with the depth of the issues that lurk behind each one of those bullet points. But that's the process that we're going through, identifying the pathways, building the corridors, laying it out, filing an application, and moving through the NEPA process. This is a working version of the corridors as we've laid them out so far. And to be clear again, in the individual plans like the Bighorn Basin, the corridors that we suggest, that we will suggest in our application, match comments we made in the RMP revision for the Bighorn Basin, similarly with Lander. But we've tried to stitch the world together. We've tried to create alternatives. We didn't want to create a single pathway. There are any number of things that could come up to make a given route unacceptable in the future. So having some alternatives was helpful. This corridor down here actually matches a CO2 pipeline that goes down to Colorado, and to just put a little flavor on it, we contacted the BLM office for Colorado that adjoins the border of Wyoming there, and asked them for their resource management plan and the files showing where their corridors were, because we wanted to be in sync across state lines if we could. Their response was, well, we can give you a copy of the plan, and if you can figure out what they are, would you give us a copy of the map when you're done? So, I don't know if we made it that far, but so this is where we're headed. You'll see that in large part of the state where there are not a great deal of public lands, that's why we're not out there. So it's not a case that we don't expect that, for example, you might come down here and pick up CO2 from DKRW, or you might come down to the Laramie River Plant or Dave Johnson. The reason you don't see a corridor is that you don't have to deal with the BLM to do it. So this is driven by the reality of where is the federal lands issue that we're trying to fix. And so the corridor will reflect that. So we're working through our, writing the plan of development, getting resource issues identified. The tangible next step is to file the right-of-way application, to kick all this off. Following that, we'll begin the NEPA process and the environmental analysis and the gathering of data. We have not yet decided what date that process of contacting contractors and hiring contractors will be. So for any contractors that might be in the room that are looking for a date certain to put in your planner, I don't have one for you, but we do hope to file the right-of-way application in February, so the process following that. So I'll give you some idea, but I couldn't give you any more date specific than that. So currently we're wrapping up the plan of development. It's a 127-page document, working on resource issues, developing the alternatives. We've been at this process for about a year internally, and getting to the right-of-way application, like I say, is the big next step. And just a reminder, why are we doing this? It's all about economic activity and revenues for the state. This is the impact of oil and gas in Wyoming. It's ubiquitous in the state. The only county in which there is not production, I believe, is Teton County. It's significant in nearly every county as to its county revenue impact, and in 14 of them is the largest activity in the county. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions about where we stand, what we're trying to do, etc.